Thank you, Vicky, and thank you everyone for coming. Of course, a major reason, apart from Edge Hill being beautiful, a major reason for being here is because of Vicky's work, and obviously the report that's just about to come out on transforming lives is really exciting work. And this notions of transforming and transformative will work through a lot of what I'm talking about. At the UNESCO level, when we worked on the UNESCO strategy for vocational education training globally, this notion of transforming and transformative. So we need to transform vocational education training so it can have a transformative role in people's lives, in the economy, and of course thinking about society and the environment. And so it's not, we can't go on the way we are for multiple reasons. So we've got to find ways of transforming. It's not about just making it better. It's about trying to find new ways of thinking and doing in the vocational space. So that's very much at the heart of what I want to talk about. This work is mainly focused on Africa and the global level, but some of it clearly talks to the UK setting. I'm not going to spend a lot of time about the stuff that I don't like, because I spend too many times in presentations going through this long justification, which is fine if I have to stand in front of economists and argue with them. But seeing I'm not standing in front of economists today, I'm not going to try and have a big argument, which we won't, which we never agree on anyway. So what I want to say is basically that we've got a global approach to vocational education and training that has a set of things in it. But it doesn't work. We had the reform in this country after the 92 Act of the sector. Look at what's being talked about now. Look at what the AOC are doing. Look at colleges like, I think some of the colleges in the country are on strike at the moment. For that 25 years plus of reforms, we don't have a better system. We have, of course, fabulous work going on. We have people's lives being transformed, but the policy, the theory of what should have worked is not working. We look at Australia, the Australian college system, seen by many as the best in the Anglophone world, is in crisis. Massive drops in numbers, largely because of ideological reasons, taking money out of the state system. South Africa, as the best African system, 2% throughput rate of students in the main vocational qualification. So of those starting a 3-year qualification at college level, 2% finish successfully on time. That is not even close to a debate about whether it's glass half full. That is not working. And those of us who've been working on policy in South Africa over that period, of course, have to take some culpability in that process. It was a lot harder than we thought. And my involvement in that process goes back to being a PhD student and working on provincial policy in Gauteng, Johannesburg, Pretoria, which, because it was leading the most important ANC province, was the province that was going to lead the whole policy process. And I've been involved in lots of the policy processes since then. So we've got a model that doesn't work practically. The policies do not work. Part of that is because the theory is unsound. It's a narrow human capital view, which if it ever worked, and I don't think it ever did, it certainly can't work for the future because it cannot address the concerns about how we live within the planetary boundaries. It simply has been complicit in the problems of the environment. And so on those grounds alone, we've got to do something, and urgently, but it's not been working. Now, I want to suggest, again, not spending too much time on this slide, but when it's acknowledged that there is failure, the failure isn't the politicians. And as you know, we've got excellent politicians in this country. They're really good at what they do. Could be no possible criticisms at the moment. When the failing, if anyone's failed, it's the young people. They're the ones. They're lazy. They made the wrong choices. They don't aspire enough. even the language, they're neat, they're not something. It's not about what they are, it's about what they're not. In South Africa, where I work a lot, a couple of ministers said, yeah, it's just they're lazy. I'm more inclined to think that ministers are lazy rather than young people, because ministers can afford to be lazy. Young people generally can't afford to be lazy most of the time, because particularly, well, it's true in this country, but so much more true in Africa, you can't afford to be lazy. How are you going to live? It's not like there's a welfare state that's going to prop you up in spite of the rhetoric in this country. So the orthodoxy doesn't understand work. It doesn't understand that labour markets are social and political structures as well as simply a market. And that young people experience them in particular ways that reflect their histories, the histories of the communities in which they live. And our education reforms aren't working. They're not, they're not doing what they're intended. So, that's enough critique. So what I want to do is go on to think about what might be an alternative. And I want to stress it's one alternative approach. I think we're at the point where we need a plurality of accounts. But I'm just going to present one. I'm actually not doing a book launch. The book's been out 2 weeks. I'm not doing a book launch, but the book is part of the thinking. I am going to stress that I am the second author. And that is very much, you see, it's alphabetically, it's not in alphabetical order. It is clearly I am the second author of this. So I want that to be very clear. At times, as I was saying to Leslie a couple of weeks ago, I can't remember which is her thought and which is mine, because we've been talking so long about things, and we tend to have 5-hour conversations punctuated by her going outside for a smoke, that, then one of us goes away and writes stuff up. So she's definitely the lead author, but, it's work we've been doing over the years, but it's about a bigger approach. And it's a bigger approach intended to try and draw on alternative thinking about development. So part of the origin of this work was when I was working with UNESCO on UNESCO's global they have a world conference on vocational education and training every dozen or so years, and I was helping write the background. Well, I was leading writing the background report for that. And one of the things I said one day was, but it's funny, the development, we say we're about vocational education training and development, but actually the development theory that we seem to be using is one that's really old-fashioned and most people don't agree with. So why don't we try and look at other theories? One particular theoretical strand that was really pushing forward a lot at that time was the human development approach, and particularly the work of Amartya Sen. And so it's trying to think about how you might bring these things together. I think at the heart of what a group of us are trying to do, and it is very much a collective exercise, is to think, and I put it here, in the kind of sociological terms, but it's about these two big things that we struggle with in social theory: agency and structure. And you can spend far too much time agonizing about what exactly is going on about the relationship of the two. But it's clear both are operating, and that those are operating at multiple levels in a system, from young people, in communities, in institutions and their staff, in the workplace, up at the policy level. So trying to think about how people are making decisions at all those different levels, how structure and agency are working together. I just want to take a couple of quick examples from doctoral students. Randa, who graduated a couple of years ago, and Vicky was external for this one. So someone working on Palestine. So obviously the context always matters, but the context hugely matters here. Look at young women's experiences in Palestine. So actually, on a range of indicators, they were performing better if they'd gone through the vocational system than they were if they'd gone the school route. But in a context of the occupation, of course, where, where can you go to work? How many times will you have to go through a roadblock? Which industries are actually available to you? Of course, in a context of resistance to that, where parents would be reluctant for their daughters to be travelling because of the risks of that. But of course, also in a context of patriarchy. And so where significant numbers of young women would not be allowed by their parents to go to a vocational institution. Others would be allowed to go, but then not enter the labour market. Others would be allowed to enter the labour market till they were married, something that, of course, was very common here, a generation or two back. And a small number could actually stay on. One of the things that they were saying they valued was that they were more marriageable because they had skills. Now, we can deconstruct that, but that was what young women in Palestine were saying. Vocational education helped me get a better marriage and an earlier marriage. That was something they valued. So, agency and structure into play. Rebecca, who submitted last week, so we're still waiting for Viva. So Rebecca was interested in the arguments about adult women returners. So there was a policy emphasis a few years ago that women should return to college. And then some research was coming out saying, oh, but very few of them get employed. It's not worth the money. And given that we're cutting back on colleges, and we're particularly cutting back on the adult part of that, it's not a good investment. And so she was intrigued, well, what actually is going on? And so, of course, that employment bit is part of the reason for going to college. But actually, what comes through so many of the stories is there's a lot more going on in people's lives. That doesn't sound particularly a radical thing to say, but unfortunately it often is. They were experiencing college as an opportunity, a space to think about the future, to get out of abusive relationships, to be post-divorce, to be thinking about now my children are of an age, I want to go to work. Of course, a major class dimension to that, as well as gender. Number, particularly in the Midlands, a large number of Muslim and refugee women who were also, of course, experiencing particular constructions of gender and where you should be in the labour market or the education sector. So, lots of things. People who had to stop a first job because of ill health and were trying to imagine a different future. So a lot about trying to imagine, trying to rethink. So, whichever kind of languages you use there, a kind of more creative or a more cognitive, people trying to work out how to navigate the world. And so we're increasingly interested in, well, what's going on there? What is the world that they're navigating? So I want to suggest that there are 8 broad themes to the work that we're doing. And I'm going to go through each of these in turn. So first, multidimensional poverty. So this is a major theme of the work in the human development and capability tradition, particularly the work that Sabine Alkire at Oxford in development economics leads, a very quantitative end of trying to map the fact that poverty isn't just about income, but it's actually about a range of things. And that's a big tradition in development studies, is thinking about how people experience poverty. So this list is taken from Leslie's PhD. Talking to young people, not saying, are you poor, but starting off and saying, well, what are the things that you want to do and you're stopped from doing, or you can't get enough of these things. And so you see, yes, of course money is a major part of this, but it's not the whole story. And in a South African context, some of these really stand out. In more recent work we've been doing, that having enough money for transport has come through as a major thing. In the post-apartheid, and the post word there is not very strong, and still hugely apartheid influenced geography of South African cities, often you have to move quite a distance to get to work, to get to learning opportunities. We are forever hearing stories from young people who have managed to get into colleges of, well, yeah, I wanted to do that course. I really want to be a boat builder, but that course is over there and I can't afford the daily fare to get there. I can afford to get to this campus and these are the range of courses. I want to be a photographer, but the local campus doesn't deliver. So having money for transport was a major issue for people who are very poor in many cases. Versions of some of the slides, we have photos of people going home to a tin shack. That's not the experience of all, maybe not even the majority, but a significant number of the learners we're talking to, going from buildings like this, going back home and sitting in a shack with everyone else. Electricity is there because people have tapped into the system. They're not paying, but they've got electricity. But you know, there's 6 of you in a room, you know, a tenth of the size of this, and you're trying to do your work in preparation for class tomorrow, and there's everything else going on. You know, so places that undermine your ability to learn. Being safe whilst travelling to and from college. Very major issues. You know, I can remember, and this is a long time ago, I remember going to one campus in a large township of Cape Town, and the principal was saying, yeah, you know, we're conscious about what I was just saying, so we're putting on after early evening classes for people, or just and study space. We're just keeping the place open for an extra 2 hours because people can come and study here before they go home. It broke down pretty quickly because of transport. It wasn't safe. Hadn't fully thought through the plan. It wasn't safe. And so people were still having to leave to get home because actually the minibus taxis wouldn't come to that part of the township after 5. And they were trying to open till 6. And so there's only a handful of people who had cars who would come and their mates. And so they had a real problem. So things like that, and in communities where drugs and, in fact, you know, during Leslie's doctoral field work, she arrived in one particular area where she was interviewing young people 2 or 3 miles from where she'd grown up. And there were several people killed that week because 2 of the drug gangs were having a turf war. You know, so that was the experience. You know, young people who were on drugs, young people who had family members on drugs, young people who were worried about the gangsterism around them, trying to find a space where they could flourish. So poverty is about more than money. And of course, there are major structuring factors, not to say that these structure in ways that there is no agency. So we want to insist that there's agency. People are always making their path through life, but it's shaped by many things. This particular literature that I and others are working in has tended to draw on female writers. It's largely female authors. And maybe we should reflect on why it's the male professor who's standing up, but that's another story. But a range of female social theory, feminist social theory that's been trying to relate to these issues. So there have been very clear accounts within the literature about intersectionality. But focusing on that, and not that it determines, but that it shapes, but that people are trying to navigate, are trying to imagine what they can of a better future given from where they are now. And let's say this really strong sense for us as vocational institutions, as a space where people can try to find a response. We're not saying those responses always work, because there's a lot of structural reasons, a lot of life reasons that get in the way, but people trying to imagine better futures. And so that's what we're really interested in. How do people imagine better futures? And how could the system, could vocational institutions, policy makers, etc., perhaps help them more and hinder them less? Of course, this requires us to look out at the broader question of the economy and what kind of jobs. vocational education training won't turn around an economy on its own. The best stories of where vocational education training systems have worked is where they've been coupled with industrial policy, with investment policy, somewhere like a Singapore, where the classic story is, you make the deal for the first factory and you train more people because then you can get the second factory, and you have a very driven policy of trying to make a new economy. Or you look at the Germanic system. The Germanic system of vocational education training, which is often lauded, comes out of a history. You have to have key moments in that. Bismarck, the unification, trying to break both the rising power of the left and the power of the Catholic Church, and invoking a social welfare system of a kind, the first one in the world, to try to keep labour within the tent with the employers. And then, of course, the reconstruction after 45 of trying again to recreate the economy and get everyone back together. So a history that goes far beyond the individual level. So we need to be aware of how economies operate, how different sectors operate. And that takes us into thinking about sectoral levels of relationships sometimes, and how particular sectors might be driving forces in that. I think it requires a broad conception of what is decent work. So I think, certainly I come from, but I think others in this tradition come from a view that work actually is important. So lurking behind the orthodoxy, because it's grounded in neoclassical economics, is a view that work is a disutility. You do work to get money, and you do as little work as possible because it's the money you want to do the things you want to do. And this comes out of other traditions, and that would include certainly early Marx. It would include Catholic social teaching, spaces that say work is actually central to being human. Now we know that much work isn't decent, so it's about trying to insist on that notion of decent work, trying to say how we can protect that. That requires us, we would argue, to remember that what gets counted as work is constructed. It's historically particularly constructed in gender terms, but that there is much work going on that never got counted as work because it wasn't in the statistics. And the feminist economists have done a huge amount of work to address that issue. Still, as we see with the gender pay gap report last week, we still see the major issues that remain, but that there's much other work going on, and much of that work is caring work and isn't remunerated in the same way. I think it takes us into it's about hearing people's voices. So if we're really focused on young people as the centre of attention of a vocational system, then you have to start from their voice and not the voice of others. And too much the policy message is employers' voices matter, and they're not even very good at hearing employers' voices most of the time, because they've got a particular notion of employers and they forget how, at a local level, who gets to be the employer who's represented on the college council. Certainly in South Africa, it's typically a white male, retired ex-bank manager, because he's known in the chamber and he's got time on his hands, so he can go. It's not the people who are actually doing business, and it's the last generation of what business wants, often representing those voices. So there are problems that much of business isn't represented. We know that the business view that gets represented at national level is typically a big business, it's not a small business, and yet much more small business going on. So anyway, so we need to think about voice. But a big focus on the current work in this area is around notions of aspirations. And again, aspirations, I'll come back to. Aspirations, I think, is a very problematic area, because a lot of it is you don't aspire to the things you should aspire. Just like you're lazy, you don't work hard enough at school, etc. So there is a very negative, a very deficit model of aspirations, but building up, particularly from Apodorai's work, a notion that aspirations might be a very important thing for getting to new futures. By being able to imagine the future might be a way of getting there. And so how do you work with people? And that can be collective. And so someone like Ina Conradi, who's working in some of the townships in South Africa with women's groups, is some really exciting work about collective development of new aspirations. But I'll come back to aspirations in a minute. So we know that access to and the status of vocational education, again, is determined by these big structural factors. So we know that different programs are gendered. We know that there's class, we know that race, all these things play in who is on which program. And of course the labour market's like that. In the South African context, we're getting people, you know, when I was with the South African audience doing a seminar a couple of weeks ago, I used a phrase which everyone there immediately got, which wouldn't necessarily be got in this country, which was one of the young people we'd spoken to, why he'd come to college was because he was fed up of being treated like a boy. Now in the South African context, that's because under apartheid and colonialism, there's a notion of Africans as being legal minors in the way that women were in this country. So a man of no matter what age, if he was African, was a boy in common white parlance, and people would be spoken to as boy. And that this was still going on in the labour market of this decade, as far as this young person was concerned. And so maybe a qualification will help me get some more status and respect, because at the moment they're treating me in this way. And stories like that were very common. And in more recent work we've done, more recent field work, about people who are out of the formal labour market, a lot of the stories about because it's so bad, it's actually better to be unemployed than to be working. And you're picking up similar things in Southeast Asia, in South Asia at the moment, in colleagues' work, of actually working in a garment factory isn't a very nice thing. You know, and if we go back to the history, you know, of this region, and you think about, okay, we can celebrate mining, for instance, and celebrate what it did in terms of certain solidarities and status, but also there was work that was very hard, that was very dangerous. And, you know, was it better to leave the farm and go to the mine or the mill? It's a mixed story. It obviously takes us into that, a language which I think unfortunately is a very technical and esoteric language in the capabilities area, about capabilities and function, and I don't want to get into any great detail there. But basically at the heart of this is what we're saying is, rather than focus on what the state thinks vocational education should be, let's focus on what young people and other stakeholders think about what the purpose of vocational education and training is and why they might want to go there. And in the capabilities language, that's about people valuing what people want to do. So what is it that they want in order to flourish? So in that sense, you know, there's a kind of Aristotelian underpinning there about about eudaimonia and the good life. It's but it's for individuals to choose what they value. That in this sense, work is a means to an end rather than to an end. Economic development is a means to an end, although an increasingly problematic one because of the environmental costs. So that takes you off into capabilities lists, which I'm not a huge fan of myself, but a lot of other people in this tradition find them useful. I don't want to go into great detail, but essentially the idea of this is to explore what people say they value. In this case, what do they value about going to a college? Of course, economic dimension is there. Vocational education and training is intimately related to work. So I'm not saying don't think about work, don't think about money. That would be stupid. What I'm saying is that's only part of the story. And what you get, and this varies from context to context, this is a South African one, so young people who want to be actors for change. And college, they can see as a place that can help them be actors. It's about confidence. In the South African context, unfortunately, it's been a lot about worries about bodily integrity. Got a doctoral student at the moment from Ghana who's working about women in the informal sector. Health and safety is a massive issue. Young people who know about health and safety, they know what they should be doing, but they're in cultures where it's very difficult to do what you know is right. If you're the only one who's going to wear PPE, what will that tell other people about you? And that's a big worry for them. Yes, I know this is unhealthy. I know I should wear gloves. I know I should wear goggles. No one else does. I get laughed at if I wear those things. I won't be able to get on in this job. So it's about more than just getting a job. So I won't go into detail, but it's about more than just getting a job. I want to come back to the aspirations issue. So very influenced by a number of Indian writers, in particular Appadurai at the heart of it. So as I said earlier, there is an orthodox view of aspirations as about poor people and deficit. But actually, what we're interested in is how people's horizons can be expanded, how they can expand their horizons, rather than us telling them that's what you should be focusing on. But drawing on sociological theory, trying to understand decision-making processes, and this is an area we've not got as far as we'd want to yet. But in Margaret Archer's terms, talking about life projects, what is it that people want to do? What's their imagination of the future? How do they create that from where they are today? So I can see these things around me. I live in this community. I can see all the things that are in my way, but I can also see all the resources that my community brings for me. I think I can do this. I can imagine a better future. I can achieve it. And trying to focus in more on those thought processes, those reasoning processes that learners are going through. And that takes us on to an area that Leslie and I are just starting to work on. We've just started, as part of a bigger consortium, a project for the South African Department of Higher Education and Training. Last Monday we started this new 5-year programme. And basically some work that we've done here, just in 30 qualitative interviews, we've now got funding to do a large quant sample alongside, in the hope that then we can, we've at least convinced the minister that there might be something going on, so she's given us money to try and prove it to her. So that's hopeful. So basically we're trying to get into the notion that it's not that you create a life project and then just go forward, but that there are frequent points at which you might be forced to reconsider your future and to try and understand that better. So that whilst those will have individual realities, a family member dies, something good happens, but there are moments that will be individual, but actually a lot of the moments can be largely predicted. And so we did some work where we were just with a group of interviews with young people, and it came clear to us in the South African system that there were a number of points that people were dropping out. And our argument to the minister was, well, look, if we can see that there are a number of points where people are dropping out, then you can do something about some of those perhaps. If you can now notice those points and start thinking about how at national and institutional level you might respond to those, then maybe you can make it easier for people to make the decision that you want, which is that they stay. So the first one in the South African system, they started a bursary system for university students because that's where the political voice was. And we lobbied and lobbied and lobbied, and it got extended to college students, who of course are typically poorer than university students. But they take a few months to make a decision. So young people would say to us, well, I started the course, yeah, I had money the first few weeks, and then I was really struggling, and it's, well, yeah, I can get the taxi fare, or I can eat. Okay. And I can borrow money here and I can borrow money there. But there comes a point where you can't carry on doing that. No matter how determined you are to succeed, you know, that point comes and something else might be the point where you say, well, it's just not worth it. There's all this going on. So we're finding that young people are saying, well, yeah, I dropped out because. That is entirely solvable at a bureaucratic level. Or maybe not at a bureaucratic, maybe the bureaucracy would have to work. So that's the first thing. Then, of course, well, they designed a system for complex reasons that has a 3-year program as the main program, but you have to pass 6 modules each year. And you can't go forward if you've not got them. Now, they didn't need to do that. It was to do with the qualifications framework. They decided that people were coming in at level 2 of a qualification system, and at level 1, and leave you at level 4. And so you need to have a level 2, a level 3, a level 4. They did not need to do that. Many of us said it was stupid. It was done. So they put in too many exams. Many people fail exams. It happens in life, people fail exams. I've failed exams, lots of people fail exams. But if you fail the exam, you find out something like the 2nd week of December. You've got resits something like the 2nd week of January. Okay, so some people spend their Christmas holiday working on the resits and they pass. But of course, a number fail. If you fail, you typically have to drop out. The state won't pay for your resit. The resit of one module is what, you know, is the equivalent of a couple of months' average salary. Average salary, not what these young people have. So typically, if you're lucky, you can go away for the rest of the year and get the money together for a module and come back, and hopefully you pass it, and then you can start again. But of course, that's a year lost. We talked to one young woman, she'd failed 2 modules. So what she was doing was she'd gone away, she'd worked for a year, come back, paid for a module, resit, got that module, and then she was dropping back out again, dropping out, to go and get another year's money to come back and do the other module. You know, so a 3-year course was becoming a 6-year course. So exam failure, pay for resits. Then, once you've done the 3 years, you've got to have 18 months of internship before you get your certificate. Are there enough internships? You can imagine what the answer is. Exactly. So, you know, then a fraction of those who've got to that point get 18 months of internship, which starts the day that it should start. It's taking 2, 3, 4 years to build up the hours going from job to job. In an economy where there are not formal sector jobs, okay, they're happy sometimes to take interns in, but there's only limited capacity. Then the one they have actually solved largely is certification. It was then often taking a year or more to get the final certificate. So young people were going to industry and saying, I've done all this, you know, I've done pretty well, I've got through this system, and I've passed. And the employer would say, well, where's the evidence? So they go back next day to the college, and the college would put all the stamps they possibly could on headed paper and say, yeah, this person's passed, and they go to industry. Industry say, well, that's not a certificate. I want the government certificate. And so we did manage to get that one solved after a while, where, well, solved. It's now taking an average of 3 months rather than 18 months. But, you know, in policy terms, that's a massive win. So what we're arguing is you can just see all these points where it might go wrong. If the right thing is to progress through the system on time, then these are a number of points where it might not happen. And so our argument to the minister was, well, look, if we can see that, maybe there's something you could do about it. So that's, you know, I say new research we're just starting is trying to really convince them. So they're bought into there might be a problem. How long it'll take us to well, of course, there might not be a problem. We might just have picked up the few people where it was a problem for. We don't think that, and everyone we talk to says, yeah, of course that's what happens. Everyone knows that. It's just there's no research which says it. Now, if you're saying all that, then how are you evaluating and rewarding institutions? So if you're saying that these are important, you need to do something about how you judge whether an institution's a success. What typically happens is you look at pass rates, throughput rates. Well, just 2% throughput rate, there's no debate about that being a success. A good college is at 10%. I think that's bloody good when 2% is the average, but that's a failing institution. They're all failing institutions by the criteria that people are not going through them quickly enough. I want to say that's some of that's to do with the institution, but a lot of it isn't. So we've been focused on efficiency, on effectiveness, we've been focused on throughput rates, pass rates. Of course they're important, but they're not the whole story. So what we've been trying to argue is that actually you could have other ways additionally that you might judge an institution, and that you might focus on how those institutions have advanced the lives and well-being of the young people who they are supposed to be serving. Yeah, of course listen to industry, that's fine, but why not also listen to what young people are saying about how the system is helping or not helping them. Of course it's somewhere in between. In which ways is it helping them, in which ways is it not? And then if the point of evaluation is to improve practice, that might be a big if, then you can focus on how you improve practice by actually asking the right questions. So those are the 8 things. As I'm saying, this is an alternative approach to the orthodoxy. It's a literature that really only has its origins at the start of the current decade. So it's still a very new literature. There are only 20, 30 academic outputs in the field, probably, although certainly we're on to, I think, 5 Nottingham PhDs, and there are people elsewhere doing work here. So it's still a very new area. It's still got a lot more work to be done. Now, part of the problem, I think, at a theoretical level, is working between levels. And I was in South Africa a couple of weeks ago talking to colleagues there, one of whom, Professor Stephanie Allais, is coming to be a keynote at the JVET conference in a couple of months' time. And we're saying the problem is we've got a lot of vet literature which looks at the classroom or the individual level. We've got a lot that looks at the policy level. There's relatively little that looks in the middle, and there's almost nothing that works between levels. And yet to understand the world, you've got to know about the different levels at which decisions and reality operate. And so we're not yet good enough on that. What a lot of people say, oh, but in fourth industrial revolution, how's this, vocational education's an irrelevance. How are we going to think about that? And I do think there's a big challenge about the future of work, although I partly preface that by saying, but we've been saying that for more than 50 years. The end of work has been prophesied for a very long time. Clearly, some things are changing quite radically, and there was I think a very nice piece by James Avis last year trying to look at the literature and say, well, what of this is hype, a lot of it, what of it is real? And of course that will be different in different settings. So we need to know what is actually happening and what could happen to work in particular settings. So what does it look like in Southwest Lancashire? That is different from in East Lancashire. It's even at that level there are differences at the local level. We know in the Northwest lots of deindustrialisation. We know that there's certain the industries that made Lancashire world renowned are not there anymore, but that there are clear industries which are still performing very well. Of course there are big debates about content, what knowledges, there's a lot, often debates about vocational education and training is too theoretical or too practical. What actually is that theory? Theory often just means sitting in a classroom rather than doing things with your hands. Often the theory is not particularly theoretical. So but theory clearly is going on, and you have the other side where it's assumed that lots of jobs don't have any cognitive content, and yet they do. You know, it's impossible to have a job with no cognitive content. And, you know, stuff like Mike Rose's work on the mind at work, showing how people are making complex decisions as they do jobs, whether that be waitressing, carpentry, lots of other examples in his work. You know, the amount of knowledge that is being used, the amount of emotional work, of course, you know, thinking back to people like Hochschild. So we need to think about knowledges, not so much in this country, but it's increasingly an issue we need to think about. Languages. What language is vocational education and training in? So one example in Tanzania, there are a series of sort of essentially community institutions which teach and assess in Kiswahili. And people do well in them. But those are qualifications, non-formal qualifications. If you go to the formal vocational institution, you have to do exams in English. And that immediately becomes a major barrier for large numbers of people. I left this on from giving these slides in South Africa, the decolonisation word. But, you know, thinking about whose knowledges, and I think you can see that, you know, it's decolonisation there, but we know that gender and race and class all play in terms of which knowledges get valued and which knowledges don't. And so thinking more about how that plays in these spaces. Huge challenge, one that we're trying to address in a current project in Uganda and South Africa, is about just transitions. How do we move, how do transition to an economy and a society that is sustainable, but insisting on the just, because the people who are losing out often are those who are most vulnerable. So jobs where you're using, for instance, cutting charcoal in northern Uganda, charcoal cutting is illegal. You just drive down the main road, you see bags and bags and bags of charcoal on the side of the road, waiting to be picked up, police cars driving by, not seeing the charcoal, causing massive environmental problems. So yes, you want to stop those people cutting the charcoal, but what are they going to do if they don't cut the charcoal? What are the litter pickers going to do if they don't pick the litter? So yes, we want to get them out of those dirty jobs for multiple reasons, but are they the people who are going to get the green jobs? And so much of the language about green jobs is about graduates. And so there's a real danger that it's just another way where people get excluded because we're doing something we need to do, but we're focused on the green and we're not focused on the people. And so we've got to get those two together. So how do you think about just transitions so that they are just? And of course, inclusion remains a major challenge in these conversations, that there's far too little thinking about inclusion across the vocational sector. There's some excellent work, but we've got a long legacy of that essentially is a form of occupational therapy that, you know, yeah, you can go and do that thing, and then ghettoizing people. You see this in Africa, in Southeast Asia, you'll see it in areas where there's been conflict and you've got amputees. Oh, well, yes, here's a vocational program for the amputees, but they're all producing the same thing. And sometimes that's selling to a tourist market and the badging of it is, you know, this is from amputees. Okay, that's producing incomes, but it's also producing another set of other effects. So how do we think about making this just and inclusive and sustainable are challenges that all our education, of course, faces. Some bits of it are far better than others, but vocation, I think, has a lot of work to do about including in a radical sense, being just, being sustainable. So last slide. So I think, you know, the problem with the vocational system, and it's nice to see my banner about employability as I was walking around. We all know, if we're in universities, that we're about employability now. We could have a long discussion about what employability means and what it doesn't mean. But too much we work within an uncritical orthodoxy of employability. It's just another of those slogans that we all have. And I want to suggest that by working within orthodoxy, which includes employability, but basically that's what our job is to get people employable. But that's actually causing structural and symbolic violence to young people. Because on the one hand, we're telling them they've got to achieve something, and on the other hand, often we're hindering them in achieving it. So I want to argue that we've got to understand the costs of going to institutions for young people as well as the benefits, and to think about those more critically, but not the way that has been the orthodoxy, which lies in rational choice theory, lies in human capital theory, but to try and come from lived experience, to try and think how people are decision making within that process. And so our approach, we think, is one, I know, you know, I've said this before, but it's one way of thinking about this. We don't think we've solved it. We think we've got some interesting things to say, but we think there are other ways of coming to these issues as well, but that we desperately need to take a debate forward. I started by noting the work that Vicky is doing about transforming lives. That's what we're about. We're trying to transform lives. We're trying to transform the planet because we've been transforming it in the wrong ways. We've got to try and transform vocational education to help transform lives, to transform the planet. That's the challenge we're working on. It's a huge challenge. We needed to do it yesterday. We've just got to keep trying to push forward on it. So thank you very much.